someone took on a rule, like let's say to be honest all the time, and then that, because he's decided to always follow that rule, he will then get himself into different situations. Thinking of the future, he's like, well, I'm going to have to tell the truth, therefore I'm not going to cheat on my wife. You know what I mean?
Well, I think people certainly have certain kinds of practices that they live by, and but they're partly practices, but they're also an expression of habit. But of course, it's one of the interesting things about humans too, that we can change our habits, and we see ourselves falling into a bad pattern, and we reflect on it. And we can change that. How exactly that happens, one has no idea. Certain kinds of rule following, though, can seem really bizarre. I don't know how many of you read this article in the New Yorker a couple of years ago about the guy who was determined to be an absolute thoroughgoing utilitarian. And he made quite a lot of money, and he had a wife and several children, but he thought, I have to maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So he gave all the money away. And his wife, of course, was very upset. I mean, what are we going to do about the... Okay, so then he realized that he had 2 kidneys. I'm not joking. And so he finally, this took a huge effort to convince doctors to take a perfectly good kidney and give it to a perfect stranger. But he said, I'm trying to maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And things kind of went downhill from there. And it's interesting that we all recognize that kind of rule following, is sort of ideal in a certain kind of John Stuart Millian sort of way, but it's deeply crazy.
Was he a philosopher?
He wasn't. Well, actually, no. But, it's a fair question. He had, I've forgotten just how he made all his money, but then he did start studying philosophy and taking philosophy classes and getting very wrapped up in the idea that Mill was right. And that he had these things to give away, and he did. He gave and gave until basically he was completely penniless and broken, and then had no wife, no family, because everybody was fed up with him. Every time he got anything, he gave it away. Yeah. Sorry, actually, there was a chap behind you.
I was hoping you could say a little bit more about the difference between the kind of reasoning that leads to action, that sort of moral reasoning that you talked about here, and the kind that we do post hoc. Why would they? So I thought you said at one point that it's the post hoc rationalization that tends to be more sort of deductive in structure and appealing to rules. Now, why would that be the case? I'm genuinely curious why that whole practice of rationalizing in that manner would have evolved.
Why we appeal to rules of thumb and
We're not using them to guide our action. What are we doing? Why are we deluding ourselves so much?
Well, it may be, here's a sort of simple-minded way of looking at it, and I'm not sure this is going to be helpful. But it may be the brain is smarter than you think, in the sense that by not following and adhering strictly to these particular rules, say from Exodus, you actually end up leading a more useful and happy and productive life, and you're a better citizen. On the other hand, of course, part of the game that, at least in some cultures, we play is requiring people to justify why they did what they did, especially if it was something that we didn't like. Now, Roger Bingham and a number of other people who've thought a lot about morals in this context have made the observation, which I think is really important, and you see this in chimpanzee culture and baboon culture and elsewhere. Reputation is extremely important. It is a huge value. And it is an abstract thing, perhaps, but chimpanzees protect their reputation, and we certainly do. So if you've done something that offended your mother because she thought you should have taken care of your little brother and instead you were off mowing the neighbor's lawn and asks you for a justification, you feel compelled to come up with something that sounds reasonable. Now, often, of course, we see right through people's justifications. So I think that's part of the story. And the thing of it is, you know, it's not just that we engage in this sort of confabulation in the moral domain. I think Mike Gazzaniga was the first person to really bring this to my attention in the case of the splits. I mean, everybody knows these stories, but let me just remind you. So, a split brain patient knows full well that he's a split brain patient, has been tested for years, understands the anatomy, understands the disconnection effect, the whole thing. He's sitting there, he's flashed a command, go shut the door. He gets up and wanders off, shuts the door, comes back. Mike says, why did you shut the door? Now, the signal was flashed to the right hemisphere. It's the left hemisphere that's talking. But the left hemisphere did not see the flashed signal. The left hemisphere says, well, it's cold in here. I just thought I'd like to shut the door. Or something, right? They always make up something, which is exactly what you and I would do in the same circumstances. But here's what I think is so wonderful about all of these cases that Mike Gazzaniga talks about is that never, when you do this to a split brain patient, do they sort of lean back and say, look, I'm a split brain patient, right? You know, you guys do these things to me all the time. What do I know? I'm the left hemisphere, right? Never. And you know, the great thing was that I think Mike, at the time when he first began to observe this, realized that there is something deep about what this phenomenon, which I call coherencing, of having to make a coherent story of what you did. And then I used to see this also in Korsakoff's patients and in all kinds of patients. And you see it, you know, you see it in these wonderful experiments that on choice blindness that Lars Hall and what's his name? Petter Johansson have done. Do you know these experiments? Oh, they're really fun. All right, so I get a young male subject. I'm going to show him pictures of females. He's going to pick out from two the one that he prefers. And when he does that, I'm going to put them both down, and then I'm going to pick it up and give it to him and say, that's the one you chose, and he's going to say yes, and then he'll put it down. Except that Lars Hall is a bit of a magician. And occasionally, he switches the one, right? And he gives the subject the one he didn't choose. And the subject doesn't notice. And the subject, so then he says, well, tell me again why you chose that one. And he says, oh, I really liked her eyes, and, you know, I like that curly hair she's got, which is not true in the sense that he didn't choose that one, right? He's looking at it now, and he likes her eyes and his curly hair. The one that he chose had small eyes and straight hair. So we do it all the time. I mean, I don't think it's a failing. I think it's just a feature of how we coherence our world. He did this also with tastes of jam. And amazingly, you know, we would have apricot jam and raspberry jam, and people would taste it. And, no, I'm definitely going for the raspberry jam. And so he'd switch it around, and he said, now, would you taste this again? Make sure this is the one that you tasted. He switched them now. He said, yeah, that's it. I just really like. What do you like about that? Well, I've always been fond of apricot jam, except that they chose the other one. Right? Who knows? When I saw the one on that was videotaped, the jam one, the people were just, really? I chose that one? I'm sure if it's a major decision, right, you're going to choose one of these people and you're going to live with them the rest of your life, then of course you're going to put more effort into it, I suppose. So, I mean, Terry made this point this morning about introspection and that, you know, things even in the visual world, aren't as they seem. You know, it seems like I look out there and I see everything in all the detail, and it's all integrated across time, and it isn't true. And I think in the decision-making world, we have a certain kind of folk psychology about ourselves. And the folk psychology is that we're completely aware of our intentions and that they precede our decisions, and that in the moral domain, that's preceded by application of a rule, conscious application of a rule. And I think probably that's all wrong. And that lots of decision-making is not preceded by a conscious intention at all. Now, how we behave such that, you know, we do these things like speak and choose and shut the door, you know, that's another question. But it's both kind of exciting and daunting to realize that our introspective access to the way our brains work is quite limited. Quite limited. I'm not sure who is next, but I think you and then Keith. Yeah, sorry.
Can you imagine a circumstance in which we don't have any ears, by which to sort of launch our thought? So
We don't have any ears?
any ears. We don't have the ears circumstance. IS.
Oh, ease.
A totally novel circumstance, right? So presumably you have your history of habits and your history of choices that you've made in the past, but presumably you have your current emotional state and your current arousal state and all that kind of stuff. So a completely blank is state is not likely to...
No, I'm sure that's true.
exist.
Yeah.
But you could intuit some circumstances in which you don't have a lot of other practical examples or circumstances to use to launch off your decision about what you now ought to do if the is really preceding the ought. I mean, in that instance, what sort of intuition would you have about the decision-making process there?
I guess what your example is asking is, suppose you're confronted with a completely novel situation.
Well, so for example,
And then you're totally flummoxed. What do you do then? And I think different people respond in different ways. Right? I mean...
right, but those decisions may have all the same sort of consequences of any other kind of moral decision that I might make. So if I can approach it in a different way, then I don't necessarily have to go with the framework that starts in the way that you're proposing it, from an is to an ought. The only good example I can come up with is how one would deal with the questions of things like, you know, what decisions and actions should I take in trying to get my infant to go to sleep? Because I've never done it before, right?
Oh, I can help you there.
Yeah. But, you know,
No, I mean, it's like asking me, you know, suppose you were suddenly the Queen of England. What would you do then? Right? And I think, well, I guess I'd abdicate. But I mean,
there must be other ways of approaching things when you're faced with novel circumstances.
no, I think that you adapt and you do the best you can, of course. And, you know, there's this wonderful... I'll try and make 2 points here. One sort of addresses you. There was a chimpanzee troupe that was being filmed. And the alpha male had been done in, so he died. He was gone. So there were two. One was a 19-year-old and one was a 35-year-old. And the 19-year-old was, you know, kind of hadn't, let's say, tended to his reputation. So that when he got a monkey, he ate it all himself. And he didn't really bother to consort with the high-ranking females or the low-ranking ones either. He just kind of did what he did. Whereas the other one was very political. So when it came time for them to confront each other, the old guy, the 35-year-old, had all of this support behind him, and this one was alone. And so the old guy became the leader of the troop. Now, pretty soon what you notice on the videotape is the young guy begins to tend to his reputation. He starts fondling the babies of the high-ranking women. And he begins to share food. And he cultivates, over a long period of time, he cultivates a completely new strategy. Now, I kind of like this because it speaks to the idea that even chimpanzees can, once they realize that a strategy is not working, they can change, and heaven knows how that's done. But it also was kind of a novel situation for him. He'd never really challenged the alpha male before. He'd never really tested the political power of this guy before. And he had a novel situation. He had to back down, and he learned a lot from it. But how do we behave in novel situations? I mean, I think that it's tremendously variable. Some people are very risk averse, and some people are risk prone, and some people are introverted, and some people are extroverted. And I think those are very deep personality traits that have a big effect. But I wouldn't want to say that I have a good answer to that. But well, you have to show me, I guess. I mean, in those situations where I've been confronted with a complicated thing, let's say you're out in the bush and you're in a raft and you have a problem, and you just behave, and your behavior is totally governed by those habits that you've learned in the past that stand you in good stead. You do not have time to get smart about applying a rule. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this discussion goes on. I mean, I disagree with the general analysis on like constraint satisfaction idea, but I just feel like the concept of what we would have started off thinking of as morality has kind of just slipped away. Because basically what we're all talking about is how to make sensible decisions, how to get along, how to make things work out in your group. And you try to put aside at the beginning things like etiquette is somehow not quite morality. But if you start going back to our common sense initial understanding, why is morality important, we want to distinguish being immoral from being not only impolite, but being stupid, being unwise. There's lots of ways to screw up. And of course, you know, the spectacular examples of morality in our modern times especially involve civil disobedience, where in fact it's somebody who basically goes against the in-group, often in favor of an out-group. In fact, I mean, the whole basis of the simple story that it starts is it's us versus them. So it's all about the in-group. So is it immoral to kill somebody in your group? Of course it is. It's immoral not to kill someone in the out-group. But, you know, you don't have to be super religious to start to think that something is missing here in terms of what we really mean by morality, which goes, even though everything you said is basically true, and you furthermore could easily argue that indeed it's simply the case that moral judgments have little or nothing to do with everyday life for most people in ordinary situations, and in fact often it's only when you're confronted with a real problem. And even then you can recognize, for example, I might think, you know, what Bush has done is immoral. You know, I ought to be on the streets next day kind of stuff. But I don't do it. I got my life to live and so forth. I need his grant money even. But if someone did that, I might actually say, yes, they're in some sense more moral than I, certainly braver. What does this whole story say about that distinction?
Well, I think that I'm very Aristotelian about this. In the sense that I think that it's all about practical life, it's all about social living, and that sometimes certain questions arise that have tremendous consequence. Now, the other part of the Aristotelian story, which I didn't talk about here, and I think maybe does speak a little bit to this, is that I referred to cultural practices, conventions, ways of doing things. And so, for example, it was very typical for the Inuit that when someone became unproductive to the group and became a burden to the group, it was the cultural practice to leave on the ice floe. We tend not to do it that way. Now, the other Aristotelian part, then, is how you elevate a cultural practice into an institution or into something that has a framework and a set of ways of doing things that can be evaluated and made better, or in some cases can be made worse. So Aristotle's conception of morality was in a way that a huge amount of it is going to be embodied in your institutions, your judicial institutions, your government institutions, educational institutions, in the way that much of our knowledge is embodied in our artifacts. Our computers, our books, our automobiles, our houses, our windows, and so forth. And so, in a way, the deep questions about morality are, I think, how to frame those institutions. That's where the real sort of heavy lifting has to be done. How to have a judicial system that does things in a fair-minded way, or does things in a way that promotes the long-term stability of the group, which is really what that, I think, comes to. So, I mean, Francis Crick was fond of, and we had many long discussions on these topics of saying, look, when I say, I just don't understand morality at all. It makes no sense to me. And he'd say, look, there's two parts to it. There's the biology, and there's politics, and there isn't anything else. And by politics, I think he meant something very broad that included cultural practices at one end and things like legislation and institutions of, like the criminal justice system at the other end. And I think that's where most of the heavy-duty issues of morality actually lie. As to many of these other questions, I think it's often hugely in dispute where the moral correct story lies when you go back and look at some of the things that were done in the 60s in the name of stopping the war and in the name of the left wing and so forth. You look back on them now and you're horrified. What were those people thinking? I mean, I was safely up in Canada, so I didn't see it in full frontally. But so, and yet, it's very easy to claim moral righteousness on your side, right? I mean, this was something that Nietzsche understood very well. You rise up and you yell out, that's immoral, and what you're doing is really taking a stick and beating someone over the head with it. Well, I think getting it right is often very, very difficult because there are competing values, and I don't think there is anything more to it than, as Francis said, there's the biology, and the way the biology gets tuned up in the ecology, and then there's politics. And in a way, that's simple. It's a simple story of morality, and that's why it appeals to me. But the questions about the institutions are not simple. Those are really, really hard. And there, I feel very stupid. I think people from political science and economics have much more to say than I do.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.